Welcome, everybody, to Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, Igniting Leadership Excellence. This is season 3, episode number 53, and today we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln and leadership. I'm Rick, and this is my co host, Emily.
Welcome back.
You don't have to be a firefighter to listen to this podcast, and those of you who have been listening for a while are saying, I know, I know, I know, but we don't know who knew or who's new that is listening. So we do know for a fact
Yeah.
that there are people who are not in the fire service that are listening to this podcast. And also, I want to thank those of you who have provided feedback to Emily and I, and your kind words. And so, yeah, we are looking for feedback. And also, I'm looking for interesting people to interview about leadership.
hmm
Not somebody who thinks that they're a leader, but somebody who actually has been living this out in their life. And if you fit that billet, you're in the fire service, law enforcement, military, EMS, or another profession where you're dealing a lot with people, send me an email, and then we can talk and we can see if you're a fit to come on to this show. If
Yeah.
you've been listening to several of the episodes, you should have an idea of whether or not you fit for this. So today, February the 12th, is Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and we're going to give you a chronological synopsis of his life. Something that's probably missing from the history lessons in the public school system today. So, Emily, go ahead and give everybody a brief rundown there on Abraham Lincoln's life.
Yeah. So he was born in Kentucky in 1809. His family moved to Indiana in 1816. And 2 years later, unfortunately, in 1818, his mom passed away. Then in 1830, the family moved to Illinois, and Lincoln worked in various jobs throughout that time frame. So, what started his leadership development was in 1832, he became a captain in the militia during the Black Hawk War, where he did see combat but helped to bury fallen comrades. And also in 1832 was also the year of his first political campaign. And then he served in the Illinois House of Representatives from 1834 to 1842, and then became a lawyer in 1836. And then in 1842 was when he married Mary Todd.
Yeah, and probably a lot of people who are familiar with Abraham Lincoln, or even certain the myths of Abraham Lincoln, is him being the rail splitter, reading late at night by candlelight. He was actually quite an extraordinary man. He was a man that had a lot of grit. But then he got
Yeah.
involved in national politics, and from 1847 to 1849, he served as a United States congressman. And then in 1854, Lincoln re entered politics after the Kansas Nebraska Act. And in 1858, we had the famous Lincoln Douglas debates that took place during the Senate race. And then the pivotal time arrived for Lincoln to elevate the presidency. And in 1860 was when he was elected. And in 1861, he was sworn in as the 16th president of the United States. Now, folks, for those of you who are not familiar or never heard it before, from your high school or college history classes, there was a lot of turmoil that was taking place in the United States of America. A lot of turmoil between the North and the South, turmoil over slavery.
Yep.
And there was a lot of unrest that was taking place, a lot of bloodshed that was taking place in the country at the time. And there were threats from the South, particularly South Carolina, that if Lincoln was elected president, that they were going to leave the Union. And so ultimately that happened on April 12th, 1861. Confederate forces in the state of South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. And that then split the nation, and a bloody civil war took place over the next 4 years. Brother fighting, literally, at times, brother fighting brother, father fighting son. We had family members that were serving on both sides, in the North and the South, and it split the nation into just a really bloody, sorrowful time in our nation's history. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of this stuff has occurred here in the streets of America in Los Angeles this past year, 2025. And now, currently, as Emily and I are recording, the stirred up political paid protesters showing up in the streets of Minneapolis and challenging and taking on law enforcement. And I'm just going to say this right here, folks. If you've been listening and you don't know where we stand, is listen, my nephew is a police officer in West Virginia. And he has said, you play stupid games, you're going to win stupid prizes. So you're going to try to drive over a law enforcement officer with your car. That's a deadly weapon. And then if they have to draw down and use deadly force, then so be it. People who are tearing up our streets, they are criminals. And ICE is doing their job of ridding the streets of America of criminal elements. So that's where we stand right there on that issue.
Yeah.
Now, in 1863 is when Abraham Lincoln, January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in just the Confederate States. The Confederate States. 1864, Lincoln was reelected president, and then in April 1865, the Confederates surrendered. And tragically, on April the 14th, 1865, Lincoln was shot and assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Then Abraham Lincoln died in the early morning hours of April the 15th. And just so much tragedy that came out of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I think, outside of the Bible statistics that I've read, the annual sales of the Bible top all other books, but the Civil War is the most wrote about topic in America. My bookshelf
I
is
was just
full.
about to say,
Yeah,
let's tell our audience how many books do you have just on Gettysburg alone?
on Gettysburg. I have over 100 books on the Gettysburg campaign uh, alone. So there's many lessons that can come out of this.
Yeah. Lincoln really was just like thrown in the fire when he got elected as
Absolutely.
president. And so there is a lot of leadership qualities we can take from him. So we are going to talk about specifically three leadership lessons that tie to the fire service. So one of them is character before rank. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, when we take a look at Abraham Lincoln and his beliefs, uh, his work ethic, and how he led, he was a humble man. And he also led with integrity, and he certainly had resolve. Someone, you just mentioned it, Emily, someone who steps into the presidency under those circumstances, under threats. Now, there's been a lot that has
Yeah.
been written on Abraham Lincoln as well, and there are people that are going to find fault with him for what he did or what he did not do. And, it's really easy to look back in hindsight, but at the time, he certainly was coming under tremendous attack,
Oh, yeah.
not only by people from the Democratic Party, but people from his own party, the Republican Party.
Yeah.
There was threats on his life just before the inauguration, and he slipped into D.C. the back way through Baltimore, which at that time there was a lot of unrest that was taking place in Baltimore
Mm.
as well. So, yeah, he had an incredible amount of resolve, but character. He was character. Now, the badge automatically does not create trust. And I'm talking about anybody who's wearing a badge, whether it's fire service, police, or EMS, emergency response, wearing a badge. Yeah, even park rangers, just because we wore a badge, it does not automatically mean that it's trust is created right there. But let's
Yeah.
narrow it down. Forget issues that are taking place out in the public. I'm not addressing that right now. I'm talking about down at the level, at the worker bee level, police, fire, EMS. Just because we have a badge and we promote up, or in the case of law enforcement, where you're wearing stripes as well for sergeants or corporals, depending on the rank structure, that does not create automatic trust.
Hmm.
Crews in the fire service are following officers they respect, not just simply because of that legal authority that comes with the rank. Now, yeah, there's a lot of compliance that can take place there. It's like somebody may not respect their lieutenant or their captain or their battalion chief, division chief, assistant chief, so forth, like that, but they're following merely out of legal responsibility and out of compliance because it's like, well, I better do what I have to do because they outrank me, and I'm going to get in trouble if I don't do that. But
Yeah.
we've talked a lot about trust since we started this podcast 2 years ago. And you have to develop that trust in our daily conduct and how we handle things. And recently we interviewed Robin Baker, who she's an HR specialist, and she will be appearing. And she was talking about trust, building trust, and getting to
Yeah.
know people. And so building that trust ahead of time is absolutely critical.
Absolutely. So we want you, as our listeners, to ask yourself this question. Do your crews or employees trust you, or are they obeying because of rank?
Yeah, yeah, go to the mirror, stand in the mirror, ask that question, and then here's a good question that I've picked up from Mark Cole, who's the owner and CEO of the Maxwell Certified Leadership Team, and that is, do we have the courage to ask our crews, what's it like working on the other side of me? Now,
Mm,
you don't ask that question before you give them the evaluation. When I gave evaluations to my officers, they got the evaluation first. And then after that, I would always ask them, okay, what do you have for me as far as feedback? Is there anything that I'm doing that's ticking you off? Is there something I'm not doing? Is there something you would like to see us do that we are not doing? And I always ask that after the evaluation. That way, it set up an environment to where I was going to have greater success in getting good feedback versus saying, hey, I got some questions for you before I give you your evaluation. And then, even though the evaluation's completed, they've already received a copy of it. That's going to create something in their mind. Is like, well, if I tell him something negative, is that going to impact this overall evaluation? So ask them first before the evaluation. And then also, I strongly recommend that you don't wait until evaluation time,
hmm.
but you stay in that contact. And as leaders, we got to humble ourselves and ask these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next lesson we want to talk about is what building strong teams looks like. Building strong teams look like. And in her book, Doris Kearns Goodwin addresses this. The book is Teams of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. So let's start talking about like what Lincoln's strong team was. So that started off with his like cabinet.
Yeah, it's an interesting book that she wrote. And listen, this is not an overnight read. If you've not seen this book, it's not something that you're going to pick up tonight and then be finished by 10 o'clock. And I'm a fast reader. I'm an avid reader, and it took a while to go through that book. But there are a lot of lessons to be gleaned, a lot of leadership lessons to be gleaned from that book. Team of Rivals, the Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. What does it mean by team of rivals? Well, in his cabinet, the first one was Secretary of State William H. Seward. He had been a rival of Lincoln, but he's in the cabinet. The second one, Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase. He had been a rival, but Lincoln had him in his cabinet.
Interesting.
Attorney General Edward Bates. He had been a rival of Lincoln's, but Lincoln had him in his cabinet. But then also he had Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, Secretary of the Interior Caleb B. Smith, and later John P. Usher. They were all allies of Lincoln's. So we see an interesting mix, Emily, of people who were in here.
Yeah.
And what's the lesson that we can take away from this? We don't orchestrate the circumstances and surround ourselves with our friends, buddies, relatives, brown nosers, butt kissers, yeah, so forth, like that. We do need to have dissenting voices
Hmm.
around us, and we need to have an atmosphere that we have created that, and I'm not talking insubordination. Yeah, I'm talking about honest dissension. We need to have people around us who are, when they see
We'll
something,
tell the truth.
yeah, they're going to tell the truth.
Yeah.
They're going to give us regular feedback. Now, for our regular listeners, you've heard me say this before, and I'm going to continue saying this. Battalion chiefs, get out of that office and get out into the fire stations, and not just the ones that where your buddies are working at.
Yeah.
Get out into the station so you can hear the feedback. I can guarantee that you could stay on the pulse of the crews when you know what is going on out there. Will you know everything? No, you're not going to know everything. But we can really nip personnel issues by getting out there in the stations and staying connected with the crews and giving them the opportunity to ask the questions. So Lincoln had those dissenters on his cabinet, and hey, I 1,000,000,000% guarantee that I don't care if it's a fire department, police department, EMS agency. I don't care, what it is. You're going to have dissenters out there. And a
Yeah.
quote that I have read before from Dwight D. Eisenhower, who commanding General Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force during World War II, and then later President of the United States, when he said, quote, "Let us never confuse honest dissent with disloyal subversion,"
Mm,
unquote.
that's very interesting. So, we want to ask our listeners, do you invite honest feedback without fear of retribution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Supervisors, listen to that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you ask those questions without them, the people who are working for you, with fear of retribution? I can guarantee it because I've been on the receiving end of this, where years back an opinion was asked, and then I expressed that opinion, and you and I expressed it, in a respectful manner, but then voila, it shows up in an evaluation. Uh-huh. Yeah, that in a retribution type manner.
Mm,
And you know what? That's one surefire way to shut people down. And when you're going
yeah.
to ask for opinions, then well, you better listen to those opinions. And if you turn around and you're using it against them, uh, well, shame on you. I'm not talking about something that is where they're involved in something illegal, immoral, or unethical. That comes into a whole different category.
Mm,
But when you're asking a questions, well, I'll use an example. It's like, say, hey, do you have any feedback for me on what I could be doing better? And then they tell you, but then you turn around and you retaliate. Man alive. Yeah, you're
great way to
gonna
break trust.
yeah, it's a great way to break trust. And in this day and age, somebody's probably going to run the HR, file a hostile work environment claim, so forth, like that.
Yeah. So the last point or lesson in leadership that we want to talk about in this episode is learning from failure.
Yeah, John Maxwell's got a great book called uh, Failing Forward. And then
Mm,
he's going to be having another book coming out later on this year relative to failure as well. Excuse me. Now, we have a negative connotation of failure.
hmm.
Everybody listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube, and including the two people who are behind this microphone here, have failed at one time or another. It, it is inevitable, but it's like, what do we do with that failure?
Yeah.
And my definition of failure is when we don't do anything to correct it or we just give up. Well,
Hmm.
I failed at that, so I'm just quitting. Now, yeah, there are those times where we have failed at something and we take a look at it and say, okay, this really does not line up with my gifts, talents, and skills. I need to shift directions. That's not a failure because we've done
It's an
an
acknowledgement.
assessment. Yeah, it's an acknowledgement. We've done an
Yeah.
assessment to say, all right, we need to move on to, something else. If it still is within, the overused phrase, our wheelhouse, then we need to evaluate it to see what we could do to move on.
Yeah.
Now, Lincoln had to replace
Mm.
ineffective generals. And when you study history, you study the history of the Civil War. He really was a gracious man. However, in my opinion, I think he took too long to replace some of these guys, in particular General George B. McClellan. He was a great administrator, and the troops loved him. He did not want to waste human life. That's great, but that also clouded his decision making ability in deploying troops.
Mm.
He, in his campaigns, many times he deployed the troops piecemeal, and which was resulting in a greater loss of life, a greater wounding of the troops that were out there. He was not an operational general. He had a very, very poor habit of overinflating troop numbers from the Confederate side. Consequently, he was consistently asking Halleck, who was the commanding general of the army, and Lincoln for more reinforcements. I need more reinforcements. I need to have more reinforcements when he was outnumbering the Confederates. At one point, after the Battle of Antietam, which occurred September 17th, 1862 in Maryland, nothing was happening. McClellan had a visit from Lincoln after that battle, but then nothing was taking place, and Lincoln was prodding McClellan to take action. And one of McClellan's excuses was, well, the horses are worn out and they're fatigued, which caused Lincoln to send him a letter. And in the letter, he said, quote, he has a, or excuse me, will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigue anything? Unquote.
Mm.
To some of his cabinet members, Lincoln confided, talking about McClellan, he has a case of the slows. And then finally, Lincoln had had enough and he did relieve McClellan, replaced him with Ambrose Burnside, which that turned out to be a massive failure. Burnside was replaced by Joseph Hooker, which that turned out to be a massive failure as well. And then on the march up to Gettysburg, they didn't know that that's where the battle was going to take place, but it ultimately did. Hooker was fired, or actually he resigned, and they accepted his resignation. And he was replaced by Major General George G. Meade, who led the Army of the Potomac during the Battle of Gettysburg, and then kept it throughout the remainder of the war. And so, how question is there, Emily, when somebody's being ineffective, what steps need to be taken? Is it just something that turns into talking behind their back and letting it go? You know, we need to know when it's time to insert ourselves with someone who is being ineffective, an ineffective decision maker, or someone, who is just an absolute pushover, and their subordinates are running them. The subordinates running the company. The subordinates running the shift.
Mm.
I remember a comment that I heard one time, uh, in a training, was then off, and I heard it, and somebody was asking an individual. Fortunately, this was not the fire department I was working for, asking if they were interested in promoting the company officer. And his comment was, well, why should I? I run the company from the back seat.
Oh.
It's like, whoa, buddy, there is a problem right there. So if somebody's being ineffective, that must be addressed. And I'm not saying it's got to go down the path of you're going to can them, you're going to fire them, you're going to demote them. Maybe, depending on the size of the department and the organization, they could just be reassigned to another area commensurate with their rank that is more fitting of them rather than keeping them in that position. And if it is moving down the road towards a demotion or a termination, I would certainly hope that it's not something that all of a sudden just pops up and is like, hey, we're going to fire your sorry butt. You know, but people need to know what's coming and
Yep.
they need to be given a chance. We need to work with them. But this is a gray area.
Yeah.
There's no black and white answer. And you're not, yeah, I wrote a book, okay? But you're not going to find an answer in my book, The Furnace of Leadership Development, that says, here's the delineator when you absolutely, so you're working with somebody like this. Is like, okay, we've got, this deadline here. Um, you know, yeah, I'm not saying there shouldn't be deadlines because you've got to have markers in there, but it's gray. There's gray areas in there, knowing like, all right, this is not working out and it's time to take the next step.
Yep.
Emily, as we wrap this up, do you have any other thoughts on this matter?
I don't. No.
Okay. Well, then we are going to wrap up episode number 53. We've been talking about Abraham Lincoln and leadership. Certainly, Emily, we could spend an entire year talking about Abraham Lincoln, his
Yeah.
leadership style, the cabinet,
Yeah.
their leadership style, the generals that were working underneath Abraham Lincoln, not only in the Army of the Potomac in the East, but the Western Theater as well. And just we could even continue to talk about Lincoln's lasting legacy
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
All these years have gone down the road and we still talk about Abraham Lincoln. There's documentaries on Abraham Lincoln, movies
Notable
on him.
quotes.
Yeah, notable quotes, books, and so
Hmm.
forth like that.
The Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah, Lincoln Memorial, yes,
Yeah.
which folks, if
Lasting
you've
legacy.
never, yeah, if you've never been there, it's quite a sight there in
Hmm.
Washington D.C. So that's
Yeah.
it. If you found this episode useful, please like, subscribe, and share. Also, my website, fireofficerleadershipacademy.com, is in the show notes and you'll learn more about the services I have to offer. My email is in there as well. And then check out my weekly leadership blog. You'll find that on my website and then also on my LinkedIn profile. So, with that being said, we'll talk to you next time.
All right, bye.
Yay. Bye bye.